Critical race theory. In terms of normative public discourse, it was probably a phrase that many were kind of unaware of in terms of normative public discourse. But with the kind of what we see in America, with America's having its reckoning on race, which has been transported all around the world, which kind of forces us to confront the question once again on racial injustice and racial inequality in society. We've had some people who are at the forefront, activists. We have those academics who provide the kind of language and the vernacular in which we can discuss these issues. And we have those, as history attests to, who are against this. But something else I find really quite strange is people are dissing and condemning what is known as critical race theory. So, as much as I am an aspiring academic, I thought I'm going to bring a professional on, someone who is, I consider, a teacher and a dear friend. All the way from down under, we have Dr. Yassir Morsi. That was probably the worst attempt at an Australian accent ever, and I won't be doing that again. But I
Yeah.
hope all is well. Thanks for joining us on the Malcolm Effect.
Thank you for having
Yeah,
me.
so
Pleasure.
thank you. No, it's honored. I'm honored. Please tell me, what is critical race theory for our listeners? Why? What is it? What is it? It sounds so sophisticated. Yeah. And we have people say, I mean, you are well aware what people are saying about it. We have Trump, we
Mm,
have the conservative MPs in the UK
mm.
going on about it, and they're speaking as if it is the devil himself in has come by way of theory. The devil has appeared in a theory, and it's called critical race theory, and we must condemn it. So what is it?
Yeah, you know what? You're not far off. And in the same way, both the black body and the other has been demonized and turned into a figure that could potentially corrupt our society, destroy its supposed racial purity, its national purity. That's just extended to the various different intellectual traditions that have come out of communities of color, in particular, the African American experience when it comes to debates in America around the critical race theory that often leads
Hmm.
into debates on social media. As a starting definition, it's kind of always important to remember that it's an umbrella term typically used to speak about a theoretical framework, or that is to say, kind of way of interpreting the intersections of the way race informs law, the way law has been informed by race, and the way it all translates to power institutions, and then ultimately the way this power institutions translates into violence and subordination of people who don't belong to or are categorized as different, othered, and throughout all of that, we can trace various different ways this violence has occurred. So, in the
Mm.
simplest way, it's simply a framework born out of the legal social science tradition, and it's also been informed by plenty of activism.
Okay. Okay. I would just say if you could just speak up next time, if possible, just a little bit, but
Okay,
it's fine. I can hear you. Yeah, I
all
can
right.
hear you. But just in okay, what you said right there was not problematic in the slightest. It just, I mean, I guess it would be problematic for those who choose to uphold those things.
Mhm.
Those who choose to uphold the status quo, then of course it's problematic. But in terms of what you said, and my kind of just, if I was to summarize that, it is a framework that informs us of how we understand race and how
Mm.
racism informs our institutions and permeates our institutions at almost every level. Is that an accurate summarization of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one way to say it is that we couldn't tell a story of our contemporary modern formation or the particular northwestern European state and its colonial offsprings, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, South Africa. We couldn't be able to tell the story of the rise of these modern nations without telling the story of racism. You couldn't be able to
Of
separate the two.
course.
So,
Of course.
and that includes both the way these nations have imagined themselves and imagined others. It includes the way the economy has been established. It goes all the way down to our aesthetic or ideas of what beauty is and where beauty comes from, our moral ideas of what truth is, what the right God to worship. It permeates all aspects of what we may call the social, cultural underpinnings of this society, and then translate to a global imagination as well. So yeah, it's principally about putting racism and the various racial techniques and technologies that it uses into the spotlight to understand how it works and who it punishes and who it rewards.
But the thing is, then, so then, Okay, let's just go straight into it. I just want to kind of pack the kind of attacks on critical race theory.
Hmm.
The first common attack, people always say that this is just some, and again, I think anyone who uses the following term, cultural Marxism, for me, I kind of ignore. I tend to ignore because it shows that they either haven't studied Marxism properly, and again, it's one of those right wing talking points, isn't it? That we just
Yeah.
have, oh, this is just cultural Marxism. But people say, okay, but critical race theory is a kind of sub feature of Marxism. What do you say to that?
To be honest, I barely understand where many of these criticisms are coming from. The text, yeah. So, look, to be fair, there are genuine criticisms and concerns that we can find in both scholarship and with activists who are put in the hard yards and understand the reasons why they do what they do, and we have to take seriously
Hmm.
because every discipline, field, and form of political movement has to evolve and address new problems and new contours of the way society works.
Of course.
Especially with racism, it's an incredibly clever thing that inevitably appropriates and takes the best of its opposition to advance itself. We can get to that later, maybe, but let's separate, let's say, between genuine criticism and the kind of noise that comes out of social media. In the community that I mostly belong to and navigate to, there's plenty of Muslims who use the term cultural Marxism, echo Jordan Peterson's idea that basically this is a corruption of educational institutions, and there's all sorts of nonsense, denial of objective reality, postmodern and whatnot. And to be absolutely honest, I don't understand what they're saying. I really don't. I doubt. It's
It's
very
much
hard.
ado about nothing.
Yeah, and I know that there's an angst, and I could trace that. I know there's a kind of worry, and I can trace that, and I can also trace where they've appropriated or used or borrowed the language. And you're spot on. There has been a long-standing historical legacy of white conservative analytical exploitation of analytical philosophy to distance themselves and criticize continental works outside of that center of power,
Hmm.
as fundamentally nonsensical, making very little sense, and tied to the red threat scare, which was Marxism. And now we have a mixture of that with contemporary problems. I go back all the way to the beginning. The fear, the anxiety, the disgust, the anger, the apprehension around the black body extends to black intellectual work. It makes one's understanding of racism. It's not a surprise to see
Yeah.
that mobilized intellectual work in the name of liberating or empowering people of color and black people. Of course, it's going to be
Isn't
criticized.
isn't it quite funny then? So from what you're saying, sorry to cut you off there, but what you're saying is essentially the critique of critical race theory and people who are characterizing it as divisive and whatever it may be, some might even saying it's racism, for me actually proves the reason and need why we actually need critical race theory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a framework that tries to explain our contemporary relationships with one another, our relationships with society, our history, and hopefully our future, like where we ought to be going, where we're likely to go. Yeah, of course, it's needed. Racism. As I go back to that point, there's no way we could tell a story of modern formations of nation states without telling a story of racism. You could not tell a story of America and just
Yeah.
exclude what it did to Native Americans, exclude slavery, exclude Jim Crow. You can't tell that story, and to assume that it's located and fixed in the past and it has no consequence today is to exclude how institutions were built through racism and
Yes.
through what racism produced, from our labor practices to our standards of what constitutes normal and so forth. So it's absolutely needed, but it's needed because racism exists, and
Yes.
as long as that exists, and it is, I think, the role of anybody who's trying to resist its violence to first understand how that violence works.
Of course. In terms of like a historical context, if you just don't mind, so it was born out by intellectuals, lawyers, and academic in America, correct?
Yep. So
And kind of give me like a historical breakdown of critical race theory, its development, maybe some of its thinkers.
yeah, so typically it starts with the figure of Derek Bell, who I think it's
Okay.
around the 80s, and he was dealing with his own school. Comes out of Harvard Law
Okay.
School, and there was certain protests and discussions around the neutrality or the colorblindness of the American legal system, and what law meant. I think initially there was a resistance by certain students,
Okay.
continuing, if you will, that kind of civil rights movement. But a big assumption of critical race theory is the critical part, which refuses to take certain things as common sense. One of these
Okay.
commonsensical ideas was that liberalism as a whole is can be universally applied,
Hmm.
and each and every one of us are equal before the law, each and every one of the rule of law, each and every one of us. It starts from thereabouts, legally speaking, from an abstract sense, starts thereabouts from the same starting point. A
Yeah.
criticism of that and a breaking of that down meant to try to begin to interpret law through a racial lens, and to recognize that far from being, the commonsensical assumption that we should take it as it is, there needs to be a recognition of its historical formation, a questioning of its fundamental assumptions, and to look at how, in many ways, the law, the legal system, the corrective system has been used to exercise and perform racial violence. So,
Hmm.
out of that came very different theoretical assumptions born out of this, discussions, debates, and it sprung from there. Today, we can see that it's definitely expanded from its, let's say, legal theory tradition to overlap with other forms of humanities and social science and activisms. And
Yeah.
that is, if we take that simple principle, and that is to not assume the neutrality of certain institutions, whether it be the law,
Hmm.
whether it be media, whether it be a literary tradition, sport, anything, and we begin to try to interpret how these systems
The
have been
thing is
used.
that sorry to cut you off again, just before I forget this point. People will say then, but it seems to kind of view the world through the lens solely of race. And there would people, as critics will say, well, race is only a part of the story. It's not the only story, but therefore critical race theory just sees the world through race only and everything must be about color. Oh, are you saying that critical race theory does that, which is because it has to do that, because that's necessary, because as you said before, quite rightly so, we can't view the world or we can't tell the story of many Western countries without the story of race?
Mm.
Or is it that, okay, yeah, it does see the world through race, but that's only an aspect of what it seeks to kind of address?
Actually, there's both answers available in the canon and the literature. So, one is precisely what you're saying. It's not so much that the race theorist or the activist continually brings up racism or race. It's that
Hmm.
society by and large continually wants to forget and erase it, or, and a great way of forgetting and erasing something is to misconstrue it, right? Is to
Mm.
represent it as something as it's not. So in our societies, in social media, we talk about race and racism a lot. It seems it's
Yeah.
always popping up, but there's no real conversation about what it is. There's a lot of back and forth and so forth. It comes up a lot without it actually being spoken about.
Yeah.
And so one reason why it can be brought up a lot is because of society's own obsession with it, and the obsession with erasing it, obsession with burying it, the kind of defense mechanisms that society has, liberal societies in particular, with trying to keep the idea of itself as a progressive, historically progressive, universal culture that accepts all and moves closer to a kind of notion of humanity and humanism that is colorblind and doesn't see racial difference. It
Yeah.
has to grapple with that and its own historical violence, the fact that these societies were built on the very opposite of its ideals. So there's plenty of ideological pressure to bury this thing. And, so when I bring it up, or when a critical race theorist bring it up, of course there is that backlash where the assumption is it's me who's obsessed with it. It's society that can't. If there was a healthy conversation and recognition and understanding of it, there were ways
Yeah.
to readdress it. If there were proper politics built on reparations and recognition, then maybe it wouldn't be what it is today, which is basically, at least in the social media sphere, a massive argument, right? And then when that happens, is accusations hurled back and forth. One of which is that the race theorist or the anti-racist is the racist themselves because they're
Oh.
obsessed with it. And,
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
yeah, and the second point about whether it reduces everything back down to a singular problem. I don't think so. I don't see it that way. But it would be more akin, it would be more accurate to say that it refuses to exclude racism where it's relevant. right? So
Okay.
there are concepts that come up within, let's say, the critical race theory literature that range from notions of intersectionality to uh, emphasis on class, and that's intersection with race. That emphasis on coloniality, emphasis on Europeanness, emphasis of intercommunity racial discussions. Emphasis on anti-blackness and anti-Semitism that may be separate from the overall banner that we use for racism, but of course is included within it. So there are various different concepts to try to recognize the complexities of the way it works, at what point it's
Okay.
relevant to say it, and at what point it's not relevant to say it. But almost always the criticisms that come back that think about it, like the race theorist here is being irrational, somewhat hysterical, obsessive, ideological, incapable of being measured, fair, or objective. These are the same tropes we have been using for a long, long time to speak about the non-European, to speak about the non-rational non-European,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just an echoing of that. It's a continuation of that. And you go back to the point, American society, principally where a lot of these social media debates have attacked, have attacked, ridiculed, humiliated, and attempted to destroy. In some cases, have every aspect of the Black experience, from its history to its body to its rights to its freedoms. It's not out of the blue that it will attack its voice and its various different
A
intellectual
hundred percent,
motives.
100%, and that's speaking on the issues of attack. So we've seen Trump call critical race theory a divisive kind of thing, and talking about the 1619 project. And I just want to play something. This is a conservative minister. Her name is Kemu, I believe. She's the minister
Mhm.
for equality in the UK. It's a very short clip. I just want to play the beginning of it, and we can kind of dissect it and talk about it.
Against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted facts. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life. And it's the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be
So let's just talk about. Did you hear that, by the way? Yeah,
Yes,
I
I
hope
did.
that was. So it says that it teaches that my blackness is victimhood and whiteness is oppression. I think it's quite unfortunate,
Mm,
and this is why I had to get someone like yourself on, because I was watching. Sorry, someone quite rightly said on Twitter, I want every single politician who has an issue with critical race theory and seeks to kind of have it taken away from public discourse, define it. And
mm,
I guarantee they won't be able to. I guarantee they won't be able to speak about it. But this is a conservative minister. By the way, she's a black lady. And again, we
mm,
can speak about the archetypes of those black individuals who, hold up white supremacy, who uphold
mm,
white supremacy. And these archetypes have been written on extensively throughout history. But we have a black lady who says that critical race theory, in essence, teaches black people or blackness as victimhood and whiteness as oppression. How
mm.
would you respond to that?
You probably have to go a little bit below the surface here and understand, I mean, they listed a series of different ideologies that apparently go uncontested. Well, firstly,
Yes.
the idea that critical race theory is uncontested is, yeah, it's an absurdity. It's contested
Okay.
at every single level. The academic level, it's contested within itself, right? So, that aside, you have to go little bit beyond the surface, because what's been uncontested here is certain liberal ideals and assumptions. One of which is the
Yeah.
celebration of agency, idea, especially around conservative thought, the idea of mobility, lifting oneself up, taking moving forward. And the narrative of victimization or victimhood is a powerful narrative in this ideological order, because it's basically putting the blame back on people who are. It's saying you're feeling sorry for yourself. You're denying your own power. It's much easier for you to think that somehow, by virtue of you being your ancestors or your hereditary were some type, had to deal with certain violence, and you're making excuses for yourself today. Again, it's a conservative narrative. Again, it's a long
Hmm.
lasting trope that inevitably shifts conversations away from social order, in the way institutions work, to that neoliberal injunction of placing all of it back on the individual's mindset, right? And then, in order
Mm.
to recognize why it's moved into a discourse, we have to try to create some type of you know, numerous power out there. And we call that critical race theory, which is corrupting the young minds of people of color and black people all over the world in order for them to rot in their own victimization and to see white people as evil and oppressors. And it's, yeah, look, I'm Muslim, right? And the kind of narrative that comes
Yeah.
around Islamophobia, it's so similar. There's a shift away from discussing society, history, economy, politics, to discussing individuals and bad mosques, right, and bad
Yeah.
ideas. And that shift inevitably moves, it's a displacement, moves attention away from what society is to who you are. And then you have to answer back why you're not a victim. You have to answer back why you don't hate white people, quote unquote. You have to answer back on why you believe
Mm.
what you believe. And the conversation can last for an hour or two, a day or a week, but the displacement has occurred. And it's no longer about how society has formed itself. So
And,
it's it's not new. It's not a coincidence. It is unfortunate though that a lot of people are buying into this.
but the thing is, how I'm quite shocked actually. I don't understand how in the 21st century, 2020, we are having a discussion of what I see merely, even if people disagree or agree with critical race theory, it is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to have intellectual debate in society. I thought these are the things that liberalism purports that it stands for. I literally, this same MP went on to say that teaching white privilege as a fact will be breaking the law.
It's a bit, it's precisely for the reasons why you are surprised, because the moment something becomes somewhat successful or becomes part of public
Yeah,
discourse is the moment that most attacks rise. You know, look at Black Lives Matter. The whole all lives matter nonsense and blue lives matter
yeah.
and stuff. All of this comes out, and then this. It's always interesting to see people on the periphery trying to educate what Black Lives Matter mean at one fundamental psychological level. Any mobility from Black communities, any form of political mobility and success is always met with a backlash, right? Whether it's the Black Power movement,
Exactly.
whatever happens. So,
Exactly.
and then of course, a lot of people, especially middle ground liberals, who hide behind nationalist sentiments, hide behind civility, hide behind rational ideals, and that's where this nonsensical phrase "all lives matter" comes from. It, how can you attack me? I'm being universal in my disposition, but it's at the below all that. It's just an angst and an almost anger or resentment of of Black Power. Of its mobility, of its
A
moving out.
hundred percent, a
Right.
hundred percent. And I always I tell people when they're saying that, I've had people who are either going to be either they're either black or they're either white or whatever they may be, who have issues with the term Black Lives Matter, and they call it. Some have gone as far as saying that it's a terrorist organization and whatever it may be. And I've always said that err on the side of caution when you're speaking about these things, because history always shows that the people who are fighting for racial justice were always called terrorists, and those who were opposing it and who were on the wrong side of history were always the ones who said the term terrorism.
Mm.
Because I think, for example, you look at them, as you quite rightly said, the American example is a brilliant example. Tulsa, we have Tulsa, Oklahoma, when we had what is commonly known in pop culture as the Black Wall Street. What happened? It was firebombed. The Black Power movement was infiltrated by COINTELPRO under J. Edgar Hoover, which took down black leaders. Martin Luther King, and we know his relationship with the CIA and so forth. So America has a history of any movement that gains some kind of success and becomes a threat to the status quo is therefore challenged by the state. So I kind of feel like Black Lives Matter, it being criticized, actually a good thing and shows how successful it's actually being.
Yeah, there's traps in its success, and its success breeds more opposition and more
Okay.
fractions, more complications. Absolutely, but you're totally right. And let's draw a hypothetical. Let's say you and I are arguing for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to level the playing field here and say, well, we have equal amount of power. One of the most common
Okay.
forms of defenses that we have when we argue with one another is to, as I said, displace the emotional and historical attention onto who you are, what you have done, and what you mean, right? And so,
Yes.
and then the whole debate becomes about who are you, Well, what are you doing? Or what do you believe in? And almost all criticisms of emancipatory politics or a marginalized community rising up, speaking out, inevitably turns into the same racial conversation about who they are, what do they want, why they're angry,
Yeah.
why are they violent, why do they believe what they believe, and then that shifts the focus entirely, and that focus then becomes about us debating time and time again what who are Black Lives Matter? Are they quote unquote a terrorist organization? Where do they come from? What do they want? And that is society's, at least white society's, continual habit of shifting the debate around. In the same way, again,
Mm.
relying on my Muslim experience during the war on terror, the debate
Yes.
didn't come about the wars or the foreign policy. It became about what Islam is. What does the Quran say?
Yes.
What are they teaching in the mosques? Who are the good Muslims? Who are the bad Muslims? And then you have
Yes.
to fight and resist through that. And of course, there's the counter argument. There are people who are wise enough to this, smart enough for this. But then what happens is you get splintered in a public debate because there'll be people come out there and say, but they're militants, they're violent, they're looting, they're burning their own communities, black on black violence, and then there are others who will
Yeah.
highlight it, and then the conversation is turned into the swamp and gets stuck. And powers
Mm.
to be prefer it this way. They like it this way, and that's the best way to prevent any form of true mobility. Now, going back to the question of the conservative very quickly as well, part of the problem is that liberalism, and this is what, forget us for a minute, of those who are
Yeah.
activists, or those who, part of the problem is not us, part of the problem is the contradiction in liberal society. It cannot decide whether it's built on nationalist ideas of who we are, its history, and its universal ideas of who we ought to be. It cannot decide whether it's white or whether it's colorblind. And so you have this continual
Mm.
contradiction between itself. Nationalists are born and declare the impurity of society and the corruption of our once political order. We need to make America great again. We need to return to back to some holistic idea of what we once were, because their understanding of America is white, and it's
Mm.
been entrenched in all forms of institution, education, media, and so forth, right? And it's excluded and done a lot of throughout the centuries, excluded a different America, America of people of
Yes.
color, America of immigrants,
Yes.
Black America, right? And so it's established that, and at the same time, it celebrates and whistles with the Statue of Liberty, how we're all equal before the law, how we're all one, and so forth. And it has this contradiction and conflict. And so that,
Yeah, totally. Sorry, Karen.
no, go on, yeah.
No, no. I think for me, that contradiction for me, especially in the American context, is how America began, because we have the same people that wrote "All men are free, are born free," who wrote the Constitution, were also simultaneously slave owners.
Mm. Well, it's maybe they never maybe it wasn't a contradiction for them. Maybe they never imagined people
Okay.
to be anything other than white people, right? And what happens through historical
Mm.
formations is that, and this happens in colonial context as well, is that the colonized people take the very tools of the quote unquote master against them. Civil rights is
Mm.
grounded in liberal ideals of self-determination, agency,
Yep.
equality, right? And it takes these tools and demands the powers to live up to their own standards and to recognize that all people are all people, right? And so maybe the
Yep.
founding fathers, I mean, there's arguments to be said, they didn't imagine, it was gendered, it was racialized, and so forth. And at least in the Australian context as well, they never saw Indigenous Australians as equals, as humans, as people. They're part of the
Wow.
landscape, they're part of the land, they're the wildlife, flora and fauna. And so the expansion of the idea of being, was liberalism built for this, right? And some argue yes, others argue no, we can't rescue liberalism from racism. Others argue we can rescue these ideals. They don't belong to whiteness or white supremacy, self-determination, freedom, equality, endeavors that all human societies have pursued. They're, determined by what we are, who we are, and how we understand happiness and pleasure and pain. So yeah, that contradiction is there today. Was it
Yeah.
always around? Possibly. Um, and so when I listen to the conservatives speak about, talking about some type of corruption of the political order, some type of
Yes.
potential threat, yeah. that's again that it's built into their system. It's built into their ideology. They, you know, Britain needs to decide whether it's white or not, right? And how long uh, how long has it been white, and what is its future? And once it irons out that
Mhm.
contradiction, then the debate can be a little bit different. But
Of
at the
course.
moment,
No, of course. In terms of just not moving things on, just kind of entwined in that conversation is a discussion. I don't want to kind of press too long on this, but just to kind of get some thoughts, is a discussion on capitalism, and then a lot of those, you could say, some even well-meaning white people are saying this, as well as those who are on the right as well, are saying that, but critical race theory wants to bring down capitalism. Again, I think it's oversimplified and
mm,
extremely amateur take. But what would you say to that?
yeah, similar to you, I think it's somewhat amateurish. There's various different sensationalist arguments out there. Look, there may well be. This is
Yeah,
the thing. There may well be people who want to break down capitalism and view capitalism as part of the racial mechanism and hierarchy. And yeah, you would listen to their arguments. In and
yeah,
of itself, taking down capitalism isn't the end of one's moral. We don't. Yeah,
exactly.
right. It depends on how, why. I think it's somewhat unrealistic at the moment. I also, but I bring into visibility capitalism's violence and the way it's been built historically, the way labor practices have worked historically and continue to work, and how these labor practices are racialized, how the global
Yeah.
north continues to exploit global south, how immigration movements work. I mean, absolutely, it's part of the conversation. But if we were to take from your question something else and ask, there's a lot of slogans and catch cries out there that may or may not do the movement any justice. Like people scream out, bring down, destroy white supremacy, defund the cops, stuff like that.
And even with that, again, it's off topic, but people with just to kind of, I will ask you to carry on, but within that, they will say things like, just okay, critical race theory was set up by some queer, or BLM, sorry, was set
Mm,
up by some queer feminists who want to destroy the family. So I want you to tackle destroy white supremacy, destroying the family, and defunding the police, and all these slogans that may or may not help the movement. Amongst what we see, and maybe some of these slogans do not help the cause. So we hear things like, oh, defunding the police, destroying white supremacy, and then people go as far as saying, oh, critical race theory is a bunch of, sorry, Black Lives Matter was started by a bunch of queer people who want to destroy the family, and they all put that into the discussion as one kind of movement. So what would you say to the kind of these
yeah,
people who have issues with these kind of slogans?
there's a displacement of the kind of hysteria here that the other side is ultimately unethical, immoral, and you know ready to destroy all that's good. To go beneath the surface, those on the other side of to shift it away from who the critical race theory, who the anti-racist activist is, to the debate about how society sees itself. Many who make these arguments uh, collapse and confuse the distinction and difference between order and justice. They assume that if
Okay.
something is in order, the order is just. So to maintain order is to maintain justice. And any attempt to break down that order, attack that order, reform that order, ultimately will be unjust. So let's take the family
Mm,
unit. If there are feminist or queer theorists who are speaking about how the modern conceptualization of the nuclei family has created certain violences for those who fall out of heteronormative ideas of what we ought to be, then there is a violence that needs to be addressed, and that uh, becomes for some, especially conservative mind thinking, an attack against wholesome notions of society, wholesome truths, maybe either grounded in divine or um, command theory or grounded in biologically determined truths about the human condition. So
hmm
any criticism, for one side of the debate, any criticism of the current order will be seen as unjust. For the other side of the debate is if the order in and of itself is unjust, it has to be questioned, and it's just to question
Of
that order.
course.
So the debate should be around that order. What is it? So before we start just throwing out slogans of, they belong to side that want to corrupt the family unit or let's destroy the family unit. There should be, hopefully, a healthy discussion about what family means in a capitalist modern
Mm,
society. But that doesn't happen often. It happens in pockets, but not, in kind of conversations that you and I must have to navigate. So, but again, it goes down to that continual attack that the other side. I mean, look at all the features and the attributes that you've been speaking about, the criticisms of the critical race series, the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, it's all tropes, irrational, hysterical, violent, unjust, a pathology that will destroy society from within, and all sorts of
yeah.
perversiveness, sexually perverse, or politically perverse. It's all it's standard stereotype. It's not even imaginative. It's not even new, right?
Exactly.
It's so
Exactly.
that that makes it somewhat easier, but then you have to sometimes be frustrated with the fact that the conversation very rarely evolves. It just finds different ways to say the same thing.
Say the same thing. Exactly. Okay, cool. Well, I'm kind of like in our final takeaway then, in it's undoubtedly that I do believe this is America's moment of reckoning, in terms of how it's entreated people and in terms of its race relations. If you were kind of advising people, maybe some people my age and younger, which is it seems to be the majority of listeners, how can we kind of, again, I don't want to use this term in a kind of cliche way, but get woke on race? What would you recommend? What are the steps? What can we do? And yeah, and how can that hopefully translate into action?
There's a radical honesty required from all of us. You're a black man, and I think you have inevitably lived through certain experiences in life and navigated, overlapping communities. And that radical honesty is not so much about uh, what society is, but it is our place in society. You can have that conversation with yourself and other people who share similar experiences, and with those who
Yeah.
don't share similar experiences. And that conversation at one fundamental level should be built on idea of a public pedagogy, a way of teaching ourselves, of having. There are advantages and disadvantages to social media at the moment. The loudest voices, the most provocative voices get more traction. The nuanced voices, the
Exactly.
sophisticated voices get buried. But at the same time, we have ways now of creating, chambers of discussion with like-minded people from all around the world that could build certain type of intellectual movements and conversations. So the radical honesty thing is just to have that conversation with yourself first and foremost, and others about your own experiences. Try to
Yeah.
develop an awareness and understanding of that. As for being aware of racial, and this includes something that's super important, especially for those of us who live in the West, as I do.
Yeah.
It's very, very easy to turn critical race theory or to look back at the world and as an Arab Muslim, recognize the times that this society has been violent towards me. But I'm also incredibly privileged. It's very easy to speak about privilege as if it's an external thing, but by virtue of living in the first world, I've been given certain advantages, mobility that many people who share my name, share my heritage, don't, right?
Yes.
So it's important to understand where we are in this kind of snakes and ladders, racial hierarchy, global hierarchy, and to understand at what point we become oppressors as well. And that's to win claims, because often the claims that we use become overly sensationalized, turned into historical outcries. White privilege now apparently in the public imagination means that we're saying all white people are privileged, they all live like a royal family. Or
And no one's ever claimed that.
right,
That's
yeah.
the funny
So
thing. No one's ever claimed that.
and when we speak about oppression, everybody thinks that we're talking about, some Nazi level form of white supremacy oppression. We have to win the claims back to a measurement and an honesty. So, and that includes understanding my place. The clothes that I wear, the shoes that I wear, the food that I get, the coffee I drink. Where there is a violent and racial footprint often tied to these things. There's a farmer somewhere down the line whose life, my life inevitably results from the labor that they do. It's that honest conversation that helps us understand where we are in the society we're in. But on the actual public debate, especially in social media, there are certain things that I think like if we can speak about sides, our sides have to be wary of. We have to fall into
Oh, sorry about that. I couldn't hear that. Say outside have to be?
has to be wary of, right?
Yes.
There's if we can speak about sides, because for me it's more about conversations and discourse we have. One thing is there is a tendency to make this about white people and whiteness, and that's a
Hmm.
misunderstanding of what these concepts are trying to do. If
Yeah.
there is a continual attempt to educate, bring white people to be aware of their racial privilege, then I question that project. There's a point where you begin
Okay.
to valorize the whiteness of white people. To give you an example of this, we tend to get outraged when white people say ignorant things about other cultures. We kind of point at it and say, look how bad. But we all say ignorant things about other cultures. We all have,
Yes.
gaps in knowledge about the way other people live. If I ask other Arabs and Muslims to tell me tell me more about where's the biggest Buddhist temple in the world, they may not know, but they would throw their eyes up in the air if some white person thought that Mecca was in Israel or something, right? Because there's an
Yes.
assumption that white people should be better, should know more, should do better, and that's a legacy of us placing them in positions of authority and power mentally over
Wow.
there, and we have to break that down. Highlighting whiteness is highlighting a relationship first and foremost that we have with ourselves and society, and what norms that we have internalized as universal norms. What part of our fractured realities need to be sewn back together? What part of us living in this racial dominated world needs to evolve to new challenges, and what parts of our past and history and tradition and heritage can guide us, and what parts need to be reevaluated. The debate is about where we are at, who we are, where we want to be. The debate is not about who white people are, what they think, what the society is. Insofar as much as that society creates obstacles, creates violence that have to be opposed, made visible, we have to educate ourselves first and foremost and others about it. We have to diversify our reading material so we're not just reading the dominant groups. That's required, absolutely. But there's a trap that a lot of us fall into, and this is on social media mostly, and that is the assumption that race theory is about the profiling of who America, Australia, and what whiteness is. It's a profiling only insofar as much as it's a broader project about our mobility, about our futures.
Brilliant. And on that stunning note, I will leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Yassir Morsi. I will tell people, please follow the works of Dr. Yassir. I don't think you're on social media anymore, are you?
Yeah, for all the reasons we've addressed.
Exactly. Well, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. But we have Dr. Yassir as a resource anyway, and so we do consult on these issues. You are listening to the Malcolm Effect with your host Mamadou Tal. Please like, comment, subscribe, and you can listen to this, or what you probably are listening to this on either YouTube or Spotify or iTunes, wherever you are. Please like, drop a rating.